My name is Allie Slinker. I am doing a lesson for Module 8 of EDUC 380. The lesson is a multiple strategy instruction lesson for comprehension of informational text. The lesson I have developed is for a 4th grade classroom. The Common Core standards are based on the comprehension standards in the Common Core website, based on the Common Core state standards for comprehension in the 4th grade level. The objective of my lesson is that students will be able to manage a collection of strategies to guide their comprehension. There are quite a few prerequisites for this lesson. There would be lessons that you would teach prior to teaching this strategy in a classroom. That is why I have chosen an upper grade level. This is a strategy that you would want to use in upper elementary and beyond. The lower elementary students would not be able to use this strategy to increase their comprehension skills. The prerequisites for this are introducing the vocabulary strategy that we use in this particular strategy of breaking down the words in order to make meaning of that word. And then practice the vocabulary strategy. So it would be something you would do before this lesson as a separate instructional lesson. Using the QAR, the question answer response strategy, that would be something you would want to teach the students before doing this lesson, because that is a strategy embedded into this particular lesson. And then also summarizing strategies are important for these students as well. So materials for this lesson are each student would need a copy of, I am using the Pioneers on the Oregon Trail. You could use a different passage depending on the grade level. You would want it to be the student's independent reading level. When teaching it for a whole group or a whole class, you could use that grade level text. But when the students are out doing it on their own, you'd want their passage to be at their independent reading level in order to make this an effective strategy for them. And then also a CSR strategy chart, which I have here. This could be something you would either make an anchor chart, have it visible to the students, because throughout this lesson this would be something you would be referring back to for the students. So I have created a CSR strategies chart that I have available on here, but in a classroom you could use a whiteboard, a poster, anything that it could be up for students to refer back to during the lesson. So I can now go ahead and begin the actual lesson of how I would teach this lesson. So I would begin by having the CSR strategies somewhere centralized or where I am instructing. I would draw the students' attention to it. I would tell the students that we're going to be learning a new strategy today. Today I'm going to teach you a new reading strategy called Collaborative Strategic Reading, or CSR, as we noted on my chart here in the classroom. Collaborative stands for working together, and strategic reading stands for the plan or the strategy that we are going to be using. So we're going to be using a variety of strategies collaboratively in order to enhance our comprehension of a text. So the CSR has 4 main strategies that will help us understand what we are going to read. Looking at our chart here, the 4 strategies are the preview, the click and clunk, get the gist, and the wrap up. The preview is what we do before we read, while wrap up is done after the reading. The click and clunk and the get the gist are done throughout the reading. So these are different strategies we will use before, during, and after our reading process. So we are also going to use this, the Pioneers on the Oregon Trail. So I would pass one of these out to each student. So let's refer back to our strategies here. I'm going to first model for you the strategy while using this passage for you. So referring back to our strategies chart here, we want to remember that good readers preview a reading passage and a selection before reading it. Previewing the text allows us to get the idea of what the text is going to be about, allows us to activate our prior knowledge, and give us that time to brainstorm and get us ready for what we are going to be reading and learning about in the passage. And then we can predict what we are going to learn from that. That is all part of the before reading process when we preview. We want to scan, we want to brainstorm ideas, and then we will predict what we are going to learn. So by looking at our passage, I'm going to begin the preview by scanning the first page. So here I see the title is Pioneers on the Oregon Trail. I see that this topic of this section is it's boldface. I see that there's two boldface sections on this first page, the way west and packing for the journey. I notice there is a sidebar here with some italics writing. There's a timeline at the bottom of the page with the sequence of events. So I can see that there's also a picture of our covered wagon at the bottom of the page. So going through this, I'm modeling my example of how I would scan the text. These are the things I'm looking for while I'm reading. There's a quote there from somebody in 1853. I'm able to see what I'm looking for in that. So then using what I saw while doing my scan, I'm then brainstorming what I know. So I then brainstorm what I already know about the topic. So while brainstorming those ideas, it is also important, if you're in a classroom, write down what you're brainstorming on here. So you could say you're seeing the title, and you could write the title. You see a timeline, etc. Write those down on the board for students to see and actively listen to how you are brainstorming the passage as you're looking at and previewing the lesson or previewing the passage. So then you would then say what you are able to predict and brainstorm what I know from this. So what I know from this, from watching different cowboy movies and playing the Oregon Trail game maybe when I was younger, I know that pioneers traveled in covered wagons. I also know that they traveled from the east to the west, and I know that it took place in the 1800s. So then we would predict what we were going to learn by looking at these text features in the first page. So what I can predict. So after you think about what you already know about the topic, you then predict what you're going to learn from what you are reading. The predictions are based on the clues in the text that we already know about the topic. And when we make that prediction, you can then tell what makes us think that prediction. We have to have support for why we had made that prediction. So based on my title, the headings, the timeline, the covered wagon picture, I predict that I'm going to learn about the pioneers' journey west on the Oregon Trail and in their covered wagons. And based on the quote that's provided here on the side, I predict I will learn about the journey was like from the pioneers. I'm going to be getting some personal quotes and personal experiences from pioneers. I will be able to get that personal experience. So those are some predictions that I think I'm going to learn about in this journey, or in the different journeys of the Oregon Trail through reading. So then, while we are reading, we should actively monitor our comprehension by noticing what they do understand, noticing what they do not understand. So then we're going to use the fix-up strategies that we have learned previously with the vocabulary. During our CSR strategy, this process is called the click and the clunk. So previously we've learned about if we don't know a word, we then are using our fix-up strategy to understand it. In this process, we're calling it the click and the clunk. The things that click with us are the ones we understand. If we understand a word, we can keep reading and we understand the whole passage, we're ready to go. But if something is clunking around in there, it means we're not making sense of it. We're unable to know what that meaning in that certain passage is saying. So if something is clunking, we need to use those strategies that we know to make meaning of those words and understand the passage before we can move on. So to begin, I'm going to read the first paragraph of the Way West in that subheading section. So let's go ahead and read that. In the early 1800s, Lewis and Clark explored the territory west of the Mississippi. No one knew what they would find. As they traveled, they made maps. They wrote in their journals. They described miles and miles of beautiful land with tall trees, good soil, and rushing rivers. News about the wonders of the West spread. People began to dream about the new life in the new land. And before long, they began traveling west on the Oregon Trail. At first, there were only a few adventures. Okay, I read a little farther than the first paragraph. But by looking at that first paragraph, maybe I'm thinking of the word territory. It's hard for me to understand what the word territory means. That is clunking in my brain. I can't make meaning of that by looking at that. So I'm going to use those strategies that we've learned before, and maybe by looking at different parts of that paragraph, maybe I'm able to make meaning of this word. For example, when I look, there is at the last paragraph there, or the last sentence in that first paragraph, it says, they describe miles and miles of beautiful land. Maybe that is something that is going to relate to territory. So maybe I could say that territory is the land, or a big area of land. And then in order to, the step 2 to that process of once we're able to use context clues, read into that more and able to get that meaning of that word, we then use what we have come up with and see if that fits in that sentence. So let's see if the land fits in that first sentence. So I will read, in the early 1800s, Lewis and Clark explored the land west of the Mississippi. That makes sense. So now I know that I can write that meaning down, that territory means the land. It's the area that he is exploring on the Oregon Trail. So that is when I click and clunk. I make sure I get that clunk, and I make sure it's going to click with me so that I can continue reading and I'm able to comprehend what I'm reading. And then we go to the next step in our process, is get the gist. So good readers are able to identify the most important ideas in what they are reading. They're able to shrink that information of a paragraph into a main idea or a statement. So in our CSR strategy, what we're going to do is we're going to get, as we've talked about summarizing before, but now we're going to take all the information we get from a paragraph and we're going to make that into a gist statement or a main idea statement. And what that gist statement is going to be is the main idea of that whole entire paragraph, but we want that gist statement to be in 10 words or less. So first the first step in that is to identify who or what the first paragraph, or that paragraph that we're reading, is mostly about. So the main of this first paragraph we read, of the who and what, the main people are Lewis and Clark. And then I can identify the most important information about the who or what. I think the most important information about Lewis and Clark is that they explored the territory, or the land as we just learned, west of the Mississippi. And we know that from the maps and different things like that as well. And then I need to shrink that information into a really good main idea statement, because that was way longer than 10 words of what we just said. So my main idea statement could be that Lewis and Clark, you want to write this for students to see, Lewis and Clark were the first to explore, what we could say, the area, or the territory west of the Mississippi. So we want that visible for the students to see our gist statement. So that is my gist statement for the first paragraph. So then we would go ahead and we would read aloud the second paragraph. And you would do the same process of the gist, or the click and the clunk, and then the gist and the just, of seeing what clunks you have and making the meaning of that, and then getting a gist for that. You would do this with the students on a couple areas, those first two, the way west and the packing for the journey. You would make sure you would model that for the students with both subheadings of going through the click and clunk process, and then also the get the gist, and then writing a gist statement. So then once we have completed that, we're going to wrap up, like it says on our CSR strategy chart, is after reading we wrap up. So after reading, we will then wrap up what we have read. Wrap up has two parts to it. So asking and answering questions, and then reviewing what we have learned. And that is on our strategy chart here also. And when we ask these questions, we want to think about what kinds of questions a teacher might ask when a test is presented. What things would a teacher want to know based on what we had read? We'll also be using that QAR strategy that we have learned previously as well, making sure our questions, we have a variety of questions. We want our questions to be based on the main idea statements or our gist statements. So looking back at our gist statements that we had created can help us in creating our questions that we're going to create. We want to make sure that our answers reflect the 3 different types of the QAR questions, the question, answer, response, like the right there, a think and search, and an author and me. We want to have at least 3 questions, one of each of those categories of questions. So by going through the first ones, a question that we could ask in a classroom, you would want to make sure you have this in a chart or have this presented on a smart board. My board here is not going to be big enough to print all of this, but I have presented in my lesson here. So you'd have the questions, the answers, and then the QAR over here, the type of question that it is, and creating a thing like this so that students can look across, know the question, the answer, and then determine what type of question that is from the reading. So from this, we can, a question we could ask based on my gist statements that we have created. One question is, who explored the territory to the west of the Mississippi in the early 1800s? By looking at that, we know it's Lewis and Clark. So that is a right there question. It's right there in our reading. We're able to see Lewis and Clark were the ones who explored that territory. And a next question could be, what did the pioneers leave behind? This is one looking at our second gist statement that you would have created with the students. They left behind personal belongings, comforts of home, their treasures, family and friends, personal belongings. And this is more of a think and search question, and then I have to present why this is a think and search question. I think this is a think and search question because you have to, it's not in one specific part of this passage that we read. It's spread out between of the different things that saying they weren't able to take personal belongings, they only had so much room in their covered wagon and things like that. We had to think about that and search for that answer throughout the passage. Another question would be, why do you think people were willing to pack up and head west? And the answer is they thought they would get rich. That is an author and me question, because that is something that we had to dig into ourselves and think about and relate ourselves to the author and what he was wanting us to learn from this passage. So once we have created all of our questions and our answer, and then what type of question that is using the QAR strategy, we then wrap up is the second part of here. So we're going to review what we learned as part of the wrap-up strategy. To review, it helps first to go back and list the brainstorms. So we want to look at the predictions that we made earlier and predicting of what we thought we would learn, and then also at our brainstorms of things that we knew about the topic after our skimming and scanning of what we were going to be reading. This can help us look back at what we thought we were going to learn, what we knew then, and what we know now. From the text, I learned that it was a long journey and that the pioneers could pack only the essentials and it wouldn't fit in the wagon, because we did not list anything of that in our predictions, that's what we would learn. So that is something new we learned in this passage. I also learned other information. So now what we would do is we would jot that information down into review. I learned that people knew about the West from the Lewis and Clark, and you could just make a bullet point or a graph of some sort that, not a graph, but a chart just showing all the things you learned with some bullet points and a list of things that you're learning. So we also learned that the pioneers could bring with them only what was necessary to survive, and you'd go around and you could ask students to input anything more that they learned based on what we were predicting and what we were learning now. Then after that, that is the CSR strategy process, because you're going to first preview the reading, and then you're going to get the gist statement, and then review and make that connection of what you've learned based on what you thought you were going to learn, and then what you learned. So then it is important as you go through the lesson that you use this in a guided practice with the students, having them pair up, guiding them in this process where it's not just me writing down the question and answers and coming up with them and coming up with the gist statements. The students would be doing that and we would be collaborating together. And then next you would go and do a partner reading where the students would work in partners doing this same process together, just getting a better hang of it, while I, the teacher, would monitor, walk around, and give scaffolding as needed to help them with this process. And then we would do group discussions of different things throughout. And once they are able to do that, then you can go ahead and have them do it on their own with a different cooperative learning group with a new reading selection where they're coming up with the very first thing, what it's going to be about, making those predictions and going ahead. This is something that you would work them up towards by first modeling, then gradually releasing that responsibility into the students, and then having them do it on their own with you monitoring. And if a student's gist statement is more than 10 words when they come up with that, what you're going to say is, you have a great statement here, but for the gist statement, let's see if we can shrink that down into 10 words or less, and we can work together, or we can see if that student can create that in 10 words or less. And if a student thinks a main topic and it doesn't actually fit the main topic, we would then go ahead and have them, let's reread that paragraph and see what other main topic we can come up with, what we think that passage is going to be about. And my ideas for special education students for this lesson would be to provide a bookmark or a small little handout that would have these steps listed here like we do on our strategy chart, but to also then provide little meanings of those, of what each step entails, so they're able to look at that and follow along with how we're doing it. That would be also useful for the English language learners, but I also thought when modeling this strategy, it would be important to use a text that they're able to relate to and able to use all of these strategies and activate their prior knowledge and predict what they're going to learn. And then the talented and gifted students, it's important to make sure that when they're out independently doing this, working in collaborative groups, maybe have them all in a group together, working on texts that are at their independent reading level. So that is my lesson and my ideas on effectively teaching the CSR strategy of collaboratively reading strategies.